only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on psychological wellbeing for musicians delivered by the ISM Trust. My name is Jane Oakland. I'm a music psychologist and mental skills practitioner and trainer with the British Association of Performing Arts Medicine, or BAPAM. And I work in a similar way to an applied sports psychologist, helping musicians and all performing artists improve their performance and manage stress levels. I also lead the psychology module at UCL on their Performing Arts Medicine Master's course, and in a previous life I was a professional opera singer for 35 years, so I've got a lot of first-hand experience of the profession. Just in case you're not familiar with the webinar concept, you can hear me and see the slides, but I can't hear or see you. But you can interact at the end of the presentation by typing in questions, which I will do my best to answer for you. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ISM website at ism.org/webinars. So, health and well-being is becoming an extremely popular term in modern society. And I'm glad to say that the music profession is also starting to take matters seriously with regard to educating particularly young musicians on the need to consider the bigger picture in preparing for their careers. And evidence of this can be seen in some large funded research projects currently being conducted in major musical institutions in the UK. And special modules are starting to appear in some conservatoire curricula which cover musicians' health. All very good stuff. Organisations such as BAPAM are also helping to provide appropriate information and support. For example, there are a number of fact sheets available to download for free on their website. And then if you Google musicians' health and well-being, there is a raft of topics on things like diet, medication, exercise, yoga, Alexander technique, mindfulness. The list goes on. And I'm not saying all these are fully researched, but there is information out there for you to evaluate yourselves. So why am I here, you might ask yourselves? Well, I'm not going to reiterate what you can find on Google, or possibly what you actually know already. I'm going to look at some of the issues that have come up in music psychology literature, which have been shown to impact on a musician's life, and emphasise the way we can use our own power of thought in managing some of the stressful situations we may find ourselves in as musicians. I shall suggest some strategies and techniques that you can experiment with, and pose a number of questions for you to think about with regard to well-being and your professional and personal life. One thing that I always emphasise is that your personal well-being needs are not going to be the same as anyone else's. The way you prepare for performance, what you need to do to manage your career is not going to be the same as your colleagues. And you need to decide what is right for you and what fits into your lifestyle and personal aspirations if you're going to take a long-term view on health and well-being and develop a career and lifestyle that is sustainable and works for you. So to start with, let's look at what we mean by the phrase health and well-being. This slide shows the inextricable link between mind and body when we talk about well-being. And in particular, the definition from the World Health Organization shows that health and well-being is not just about the absence of illness, mental or physical, but it is about enhancing our lives in all areas, learning strategies to reach our full potential and develop our strengths. Even, dare I say it, it's actually about feeling happy. Relating this to musicians, some research is starting to emerge that explores the specific factors that impact on a musician's well-being. First, there was a wave of research into physical strain and injury involved in music making. Then followed an interest in the psychological pressure of performing. And both of these areas have been covered in previous webinars. So today I'm going to take a much broader view of how we can manage these psychological challenges in today's music business. Balance is a word you will hear a number of times this afternoon, and this seesaw model shows well-being as a balance between challenges and our resources to cope with the challenges within the context of three broad areas in our lives: the physical, the psychological, and the social. And by social, I mean things like relationships, working conditions, identities, and not just the after-show party. Now, as you can imagine, there are many overlaps in these elements, so I'm going to look at balance within 4 specific areas that come up regularly in my work with musicians. First is managing stress, holding on to creativity and self-expression throughout a musical career, the impact of a musical identity on well-being, and then looking at that sometimes elusive work-life balance. So first of all, let's look at stress management, and in particular how we appear to view the mental stress that's so inherent in modern day life. Have you ever noticed that when you ask someone how they are, or they ask you how you are, they rarely just say, "I'm fine, thanks, I'm well." They tend to qualify it by saying, "Yeah, good, really busy, you know," or "Gosh, I'm so stressed out today." And I do know I'm guilty of this myself. And it seems that how we are depends on how busy we are. And even if we're not, we have to say we are to make out to others that we have lots of work and are successful. And stress is the same. And it's almost like if you're not stressed, you can't be busy or doing your job well. And there's one research article that suggests that being stressed seems to have become stereotypical of the music profession. It actually permeates a musician's identity to the point where a happy musician can seem a rarity. So what does make a happy musician? Well, hopefully you may have some ideas at the end of this session. Bad stress is a condition we experience when subjected to a pressured situation we feel we can't cope with. But stress doesn't have to be bad. And there's some interesting work by Professor Ian Robertson and his team, which is showing exactly why, scientifically, we all need moderate amounts of stress in our lives. And this slide summarises an article that appeared recently in the British Psychological magazine. In fact, you may have seen a recent BBC programme on stress where Professor Robertson appeared saying exactly these things. So, when the brain is subjected to moderate pressure, and the key word is moderate, the hormone noradrenaline is produced, which pushes the brain into what he calls a sweet spot because of the way it integrates memory, arousal, focus and awareness. In fact, all the things you need for a musical performance. And this hormone is stimulated by what he calls rich, challenging environments. Again, rather like performance. However, what he does say is that he feels that society, and actually particularly the younger generation, is in danger of becoming overshadowed from adversity, and therefore confidence in coping is dramatically reduced. Something I do have a certain amount of sympathy with. Certainly when I've interviewed older musicians who are still active professionally, they've all found ways to cope with adversity in their own ways. And Professor Robertson's solution is to change the way we interpret stress. It's rather like the way cognitive behavioural therapy is used to reframe negative thinking. You mentally change the concept of harmful stress into beneficial challenge. Now, I'm not saying it's easy to do that, but the brain does believe what you tell it eventually. You just have to be a little bit persistent. In a musical situation, musicians may become stressed because they feel unable to cope with the physical symptoms of arousal, which actually are just the body's natural reaction to pressure. it's the fear of arousal that leads to stress. And quite often the one thing that goes through your mind is, must calm down, must stop my hands from shaking or my heart from racing. Now, in this BBC programme, an experiment done by Professor Robertson got two teams to carry out a challenging activity. I think there's a little bit of mild danger involved as well. And the first group prepared for this challenge by using the affirmation, I'm calm. And the second prepared by using the affirmation, I'm excited. Well, you can probably guess it was the excited team that performed the best. So rather than trying to calm yourself down, perhaps it's much better to learn to make the arousal work for you. And with this in mind, I'm now going to show you how the relationship between arousal and performance works. This is the inverted U model, or the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is commonly used to explain this relationship. I do have to say it's open to criticism, not least because it doesn't account for individual personality traits or the difficulties of the tasks to be performed. But nevertheless, it is still a basic model to help understand our need for a certain amount of pressure and arousal if we're going to perform well. The graph line shows the levels of arousal according to the amount of perceived pressure and relates this to performance quality. And you can see that optimal performance occurs just under the maximum levels of arousal. So supposing you're on your 200th performance of Phantom or faced with the prospect of yet another Beethoven 5, you may find yourself quite near the bottom of the scale with little challenge, little arousal and verging on boredom. Alternatively, if perhaps you're playing a difficult piece for the first time, you've not had enough preparation time, no rehearsal possible on the day and you find your flight delayed, well, you might well air to the top end of the scale, which equally impairs performance. The solution is to know your own personal optimal levels of arousal and practice skills to find a level that's appropriate for you and the task in hand. Now, this may mean working to raise your arousal levels for some performances by either, let's say, making yourself a bit nervous beforehand if you're not, or as some musicians I know do, they find new ways to challenge themselves in a piece they've played far too many times before. Then again, you may need to lower your arousal for other performances using techniques such as those on the Anxiety Webinar. What you're aiming for is consistent performance and accepting what your body needs to do in order for you to perform well. And again, no two people are exactly going to feel the same things or need the same things. To help you understand your own optimal performance conditions, this short questionnaire, which I adapted from a sport inventory, links the physical and the mental approach to performance by trying to quantify your levels of physical arousal, mental worry, and the effect that thought has on these figures. Now, these figures are obviously subjective measurements and they only need to make sense to you. But interestingly, I did this recently with a group of musicians, and two people came up with equal ratings of activation for both the good and the bad performance. The difference was their self-talk before and during the performance and their general perceptions of the gig. So give it a try and see what you come up with. Now, of course, there are many other areas in a musician's life that can cause bad stress, which also impact indirectly on performance quality. Things like financial worries, relationships, too much or too little work, becoming a parent even, touring and never being at home. I mean, the list does go on. What I would say about all these things is that if it is possible to address these issues before they become overwhelming, while there's still a chance that they can be viewed as a challenge for which to find a solution for, rather than harmful stress where you feel out of control, it's much better to do that. One of the ways to approach any problem is to consider what elements you can influence and what you can't. Put your energy into what you can control and accept or reinterpret what you can't. Now, of course, this sounds absolutely fine in theory, but in practice it's a different matter. However, there are now several organisations such as the ISM, Musicians Union, Help Musicians, Equity, that are available to give practical help for anything like this and assist you in finding solutions. Now, I've talked about reinterpreting stress as a tool for stress management, but there are other forms of intervention available, and here are just a few that are in regular use by musicians. Yoga can be very beneficial for mind-body connection, as well as keeping you physically supple for playing. Mindfulness, I'm sure you know, is extremely popular at the moment. There are many courses available, and there is some research starting to be conducted which aims to evaluate its efficacy in managing stress, but it is too early for any conclusive evidence on that. Should you feel the need of a therapist, there are several available now who have experience in the performing arts, and BAPAM will always give you a free assessment and advice in how to proceed further. You can be assured that any approach to a therapist will always be handled in the strictest confidence. With regard to medication, I'm talking here mainly about beta blockers and homeopathic calmers. Now, I'm not going to argue for or against these, except to say that they can become psychologically addictive. And if you use anything, make sure you know how it's going to affect you physically and mentally before you use it in performance. But I would add that if you are going down the calming route, bear in mind that experiment at Professor Robertson, where the excited group performed better than the calm group. Now, moving on to another area that comes up regularly in my work, and something that is specific to any artistically biased career, is how do you keep alive your passion for the art form you fell in love with when dealing with the demands of making a living from it? Music and musical activities are now widely recognised as having a positive effect on well-being in so many areas of society. So how do you balance that with the idea that playing music at a professional level can also be detrimental to the well-being of the musicians themselves? How often do people say to you how lucky you are to be doing something you love, as if to say, how can you possibly be stressed being a musician? Well, yes, we are lucky, but there are also times when that love of music gets lost in the endless politics, struggling to make ends meet, the pressures of keeping up standards, or surviving 8 shows a week in the West End. In one study of American musicians, someone likened an orchestral job to, and I quote this, factory work with a little art thrown in. So you can see how easy it is for disillusionment to set in, and the job that you once loved turns into exactly that, a job like any other. And the trouble is, we enter the profession because we love music. It's a means of self-expression, and it has been from a very early age. And so it hurts when we don't find an outlet for that, or when control over our music and self-expression is taken over by conductors, directors, heads of department, and more often than not, finances. I did some research with orchestral musicians who had been in their jobs from between 25 and 30 years. And their solutions were to find outside opportunities for creativity and self-expression, either musically in the form of things like recital work, quartet playing. A few of them conducted amateur choirs or orchestras. Others found that education work and teaching was also a way to help some feel that they have sort of more autonomy over their music and feel valued. And of course, non-musical activities played a big part in filling a creativity vacuum. Gardening and music seem to go well together. I suppose it's that physical and creative part of it. As does visual art. I know a number of musicians who paint, and also musicians who have extra jobs such as instrument repairing or even clock repairing. And surprisingly, there are musicians that have pilot licenses. Now, it may not be possible to fulfill all your creative needs within the profession. So try to be innovative and open to new and different ways of enriching your lives. For freelance players, the problems are different. And in many ways, you have more artistic control over your career. And if you are successful, you can choose where you play or teach. You're constantly working in different venues with different companies, which can be stimulating and challenging. And you're also more likely to be multi-skilled if you're freelance, which can help build up a diverse and balanced career, which in itself is a well-being stimulus. A large part of my own career was as a freelance singer, and I remember the confidence boost every time the phone rang to offer me work. It's something you don't necessarily get as a contract player. But of course, this comes at a price of financial security, endless auditions and rejections, and having no support systems in place if you become ill. I think this quotation is really a plea for more information about why people enter the music business and why and how they remain in it. And before I leave this subject, I'm just going to say something about passion, which is certainly a big motivator in any line of work, but particularly in the performing arts. There are two different types of passion. You can have what we call a harmonious passion, which creates an internal, or what they call intrinsic motivation on the slide, to engage in an activity we love. And it's a type that makes us feel we are a musician, rather than just having a job as a musician. And it's been shown to contribute to well-being and a healthy achievement. On the other hand, if passion becomes obsessive, you will tend to be motivated more by external factors, what we call extrinsic factors, such as financial gain, or more often than not, status and recognition by others. Pleasing parents is a classic one. If self-esteem is based solely on the perceptions of others, then mistakes become unacceptable. You may be more prone to injury because of overpractice and in danger of developing unhelpful perfectionist tendencies. Now, okay, that is the worst scenario. And in reality, I think it's healthy to balance elements from both sides of passion. I don't believe any musician who says they're not motivated by recognition from others, but it should always be kept in check. Whatever career path you find yourselves on, I think it's important to remind yourself regularly of what is important in the job and why you do it. Two questions I often ask of people is, what does music mean to you? And what does your instrument or what does singing mean to you? Maybe even what does teaching mean to you? There are no right or wrong answers, and meaning can and should change over time. But ask yourself, are these meanings still valid at the stage of career you're at or the job you're doing? And maybe you need to adjust or reevaluate if you're going to fit with your working environment. Now, my next topic is identity, and how the way we form an identity in music can help maintain a healthy career and lifestyle. An identity in music is basically the way we define ourselves within what we call culturally established roles, things like a violinist, a singer, composer, instrumentalist, that sort of thing. And the meaning we give to that identity impacts on our motivation to validate that identity to ourselves and to others. So, for instance, you may enter music college as a violinist. 2 years after graduating, and you may be doing more teaching than performing. Do you see yourself as a violinist or a teacher? And what would you say when someone asks what you did? Similarly, if you define as a composer but have very few commissions, are you still a composer if you find yourself having to do other work, possibly other musical work, or stacking shelves in Tesco's? The late Janet Mills researched musicians who had recently graduated. And this is a very important transition time for musicians where identity needs to shift from being a student to becoming a professional. And she highlighted 2 categories of identity. The professional identity, which is work-based, validated by others and by employment, and the private identity, which is validated by self, irrespective of work, and motivated by personal goals and aspirations. It's a bit like the harmonious and obsessive passion. So, if your meaning to being a violinist is only to be employed in a performing capacity, that is what we'd call a professional identity. And it can be fragile because it's dependent on outside factors which you may or may not have control over. For example, performing works in short supply, you may become injured. If you feel you're a violinist, regardless of paid work, that's the private identity. And generally, it's a more durable sense of self that can withstand greater pressures from outside. However, most musicians these days have to adapt to a portfolio career, and they may find themselves needing to adopt multiple identities in order to fit with their working environment. So sometimes calling yourself a musician or a performer can help manage any of these identity tensions, and it will enable you to pursue personal goals within a wider spectrum of work. Sometimes it can be useful to experiment with different definitions of self. It's a bit rather like trying on a new outfit, see how it fits. Being a performer or a musician or an entertainer can encompass a broader skill set than just being a violinist. So it's about being flexible, but finding an identity that works for you personally and that can motivate you. Returning to balance again, a slight threat to psychological well-being and identity can be either over or under investment in a musical identity. If you focus exclusively on music achievement to promote self-esteem and self-worth, it's very easy to become disillusioned if your expectations are not met. You may become obsessed with music to the point of excluding other areas in your life and then have little resources to cope with unexpected adversity. Conversely, underinvestment in the musical identity can lead to low self-esteem, feelings of guilt, unfulfillment, and being undervalued. It is not easy to find balance, given the pressures of the business. But this extract from a paper coming out of research from the Royal College of Music sums it up quite nicely. And what she's saying here is that musicians that felt most content in their work, even happy, were wider achievers rather than higher achievers, both in music and outside of music. But again, I think this must be down to individual priorities and aspirations. If you are at a stage of your career where you feel you need to focus only on that career to the exclusion of all else, and that you're happy doing so, even if it's only temporarily, if you're going to achieve your own goals, well, that's fine. But I would always just say, keep in mind a long-term vision. Know what you are prepared to sacrifice and what you are not in the pursuit of excellence. Is the end of show applause enough, or do you need more in your life? Now, talking about multiple identities, it's not only musical identities we need to consider, but also other identities such as being a parent, a husband, wife, brother, sister, friend. Which leads me nicely into my final topic, which is considering how to manage a work-home balance in the interests of well-being and career longevity. Something I'm afraid it's difficult for everybody regardless of their occupation these days. And realistically, compromises do have to be made. I interviewed a trumpet player who'd been top of his game for several decades, and he talked about interspersing his practice with a spot of bricklaying on his chimney breast, or going round the block on his bike with the grandchildren. And another orchestra player told me that the way he kept his career going was that right from the time he started training, he made sure he took one day off a week when he did something completely different. It was generally going off on his motorbike, I think, for a day. Personal relationships are a huge area of support to successful people, but they do need to be worked on. So make time for family and close friends. Enjoy the days when you pick up the kids from school without feeling guilt about time out from practice. On those days, you're a parent first and a musician second. And yes, it can take courage to take a day off practicing and do something completely different. But try to see it as part of your training routine. It's recharge the batteries time, mentally and physically. They do run dry if you don't look after them. And however difficult it may be, it does help if you can create work-life boundaries for yourself. So if you, say, have an argument with your desk partner, or your head of department, or you fall off a big solo in a concert, do whatever you need to do to get it out of your system before you get home, even if it's kicking the flower pots by the front door before you actually walk in that door. What I'm saying here is that even though we may feel being a musician is who we are, it's our way of life and not just a job, there should also be a life outside music to keep us grounded in reality and to give us extra resources to manage the highs and lows of our work. Just to tie up some of the things I've talked about today, these are some of the factors that I feel contribute to a sustainable career. I've talked a lot about fitting with a job. And if the job doesn't seem to fit with you, your ideals, expectations, lifestyle, you may have to learn to fit with that job and reevaluate other things if you want to stay in that work. And that's helped by having a sense of self that's clear, but that can be flexible when necessary in order to fit with your working environment. At the risk of this sounding like a BBC plug, an interview with a photographer on Breakfast News 2 days ago made quite a big impact on me. He'd lost both legs and an arm filming in Afghanistan, lost his house, became bankrupt. But all he could say was, I'm a photographer. He never lost that identity. And he was also determined that he was going to go back to working as a photographer. But he also learned that that work was not going to adapt to him, and that he had to adapt to the work if he was to continue being a photographer, which amazingly he has done, and he's now back filming. And I think this attitude leads me to my next point, which is always work to your core values. In other words, be true to yourself in what and how you achieve. Good artists know what they do well and focus on those. Learning to recognize any negative thinking is the starting point to reframing it. And don't shy away from adversity. Learn to cope so you can build up resilience. One of the ways of doing this is by understanding what you can and can't control. And don't be frightened of using health organisations. They are there for you and should be used if they are to continue functioning. So my final word on psychological well-being is that, yes, there are a number of things we can engage in to help keep that seesaw in a balanced state, looking after our physical fitness and diet, mindfulness, meditation, we can take pills, we can develop outside interests, but to my mind, the intervention that has the most impact is our own power of thought. It's about the way we interpret situations that we find ourselves in, our ability to reinvent ourselves when necessary, to be flexible, to know that there are times when you've just got to get on with it regardless, but that there are also times when we can influence situations. By using our own mental resources, we develop resilience and coping skills, which stand us in good stead to enjoy both music and music making. Thank you very much for listening. That is the end of my short presentation, and if you have any questions, I shall be very happy to take them now.